We are now on chapter 25 of The Tiger Rising, page 98. The three of them walked through the woods in silence. Sistine and Rob chewed 8-ball gum, and Willie Mae smoked a cigarette, and nobody said a word. Lord God, said Willie Mae when they came up to the cage. She stared at the pacing animal. Ain't no reason to doubt the fierceness of God when he makes something like that, she said. Who was the fool that caged this tiger up? He belongs to Beaucamp, Rob told her. Beaucamp, said Willie Mae with disgust. She shook her head. One person in the world that don't need to be owning no tiger, and that's Beaucamp. See, said Sistine, it's not right, is it? Just like you told Rob about your bird and how you had to let it go. A bird, said Willie Mae, that's one thing. Tiger belonging to Beaucamp, that's another. Tell Rob he shouldn't unlock the cage and let him go, Sistine demanded. I ain't, said Willie Mae. You got to ask yourself what's going to happen to that tiger after you let him go. How's he going to live? Rob was flooded with sad relief. Willie Mae wasn't going to make him do it. He wasn't going to lose the tiger. Panthers live in these woods, argued Sistine. They survive. Used to, said Willie Mae. Don't know more. Sistine put her hands on her hips. You're not saying what you believe, she accused. You're not talking like a prophetess. That's 'cause I ain't no prophetess, said Willie. All I am is somebody speaking the truth, and the truth is there ain't nothing you can do for this tiger except let it be. It's not right, said Sistine. Right ain't got nothing to do with it, muttered Willie Mae. Sometimes right don't count. I can't wait until my father comes to get me, said Sistine. He knows what's right. He'll set this tiger free. Rob looked at Sistine. Your daddy ain't coming for you, he said softly, shaking his head, amazed at what he suddenly knew to be the truth. My father is coming to get me, Sistine said through tight lips. Nah, said Rob sadly, he ain't. He's a liar, like your mom said. You're the liar, Sistine said in a dark, cold voice. Her face was so white that it seemed to glow before him. And I hate you, she said to him. Everybody at school hates you too, even the teachers. You are a sissy, and I hope I never see you again. She turned and she walked away, and Rob stood and considered her words. He felt them on his skin like shards of broken glass. He was afraid to move. He was afraid of how deeply they might go inside him. She don't mean it, said Willie Mae. She don't mean none of what she said right now. Rob shrugged. He bent and scratched his legs as hard as he could. He scratched and he scratched, digging his nails in deep, trying to get to the bottom of the itch that was always there. Stop it, Willie Mae told him. Rob looked up at her. Let me tell you something, she said. I would love to see this tiger rise up out of this cage. Yes, I would like to see him rise on up and attack Beaucamp. Serve him right for keeping a wild animal locked up, putting you in the middle of this and giving you keys to this cage. Come on. She grabbed a hold of Rob's hand. Let's get on out of here. And as they walked back to the Kentucky Star, Rob thought about what Willie Mae had said about the tiger rising up on up. It reminded him of what she had said about his sadness needing to rise up. And when he thought about the two things together, the tiger and his sadness, the truth circled over him and above him, and then came and landed lightly on his shoulder, and he knew what he had to do. Chapter 26. He left Willie Mae at the motel and he went down the highway. Sistine, he shouted as he ran. Sistine, he screamed. And miraculously he saw her, her orange dress with the pink polka dots, glowing on the horizon. Sistine Bailey. Hey, he shouted. Sistine, I got something to tell you. I'm not talking to you, she shouted back, but she stopped. She turned around and put her hands on her hips, and he ran faster. I come to tell you about the tiger, he said when he caught up with her. What about him? I'm fixing to let him go, said Rob. Sistine squinted her eyes at him. You won't do it, she said. Yes, I will, he told her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys and held them in front of her, proudly, as if he had just conjured them out of thin air, as if they had never existed before. I'm going to do it, he said. I'm going to do it for you. Woo-wee, somebody screamed, and Rob turned and saw Beaucamp come speeding right towards him in his red Jeep. Oh, no, whispered Rob. Is it him? Sistine whispered. Rob nodded. Beaucamp pulled over to the side of the road, spraying mud and water everywhere. You out getting your exercise? He hollered. Rob shrugged. Speak up, roared Beaucamp. He got out of the Jeep and came towards him. Rob quickly pocketed the keys. His heart thumped once, loudly, as if he was cautioning him to keep quiet, and then it went back to beating normally. Well, looky here, said Beauchamp when he saw Sistine. You out chasing girls? Is that it? Man after my own heart. Is this your girlfriend? Beauchamp pounded Rob on the back. No, sir, said Rob. He looked at Sistine. She was staring so hard at Beauchamp that Rob was afraid the man might burst into flames. I got more goods for you, Beauchamp said. I left him back at the motel with Ida Bell. Yes, sir, said Rob. What's your name, little thing? Beauchamp said, turning to Sistine. Rob's heart gave another warning thump. Lord only knew what Sistine would say to Beauchamp. But Sistine as always surprised him. She smiled sweetly at Beauchamp. Sissy, she said. Well, that's pretty, said Beauchamp. That's the kind of name worth running down the road after. He leaned over to Rob. Remember what we got going. You keeping your manly secrets, aren't you? Ain't you? Yes, sir, said Rob. Beauchamp winked, and his toothpick wiggled. I got me some business in town, he said. He squeaked Rob's shoulder hard and then took his hand away. You and your girlfriend stay out of trouble now, you hear? Yes, sir, said Rob. Beauchamp swaggered back to the Jeep, and Rob and Sistine stood together and watched him get in it and roar down the road. He's afraid, says Sistine. He's afraid of the tiger. That's why he's making you feed him. Rob nodded. That was another truth he had known without knowing it, the same as he had always known that Sistine's father was not coming back. He must, he realized, know somewhere deep down inside him more things than he had ever dreamed of. I'm sorry, he said, what I said about your daddy. I'm sorry. I don't want to talk about my father, said Sistine. Maybe he is coming to get you. He's not coming to get to me. Sistine tossed her head. And I don't care. It doesn't matter. What matters is the tiger. Let's go. Let's go set him free. The first key slid into the lock so smoothly that it made Rob dizzy with amazement. It's going to be easy to let the tiger go. Hurry, Sistine said to him. Hurry up. Get the other locks. He opened the second lock and the third, and then he took them off one by one and handed them to Sistine, who laid them on the ground. Now open the door, she said. Rob's heart pounded and fluttered in his chest. What if he eats us, he said. He won't, said Sistine. He'll leave us alone out of gratitude. We're his emancipators. Rob flung the door wide. Get out of the way, he shouted, and they both jumped back from the door and waited. But the tiger ignored them. He continued to pace back and forth in the cage, oblivious to the open door. Go on, Rob said to him. You're free, Sistine whispered. But the tiger didn't even look in the direction of the door. Sistine crept forward and grabbed hold of the cage and shook it. Get out, she screamed. Come on, she said, turning to Rob. Help me get him out. Rob grabbed hold of the fence and shook it. Get, he said. The tiger stopped pacing and turned to stare at them both, clinging like monkeys to the cage. Go on, Rob shouted, suddenly furious. He shook the cage harder, and he yelled, and he put his head back and howled, and he saw that the sky above them was thick with clouds, and that made him even angrier. He yelled louder, and he shouted at the dark sky. He shook the cage as hard as he could. Sistine put a hand on his arm. Shh, she said. He's leaving. Watch. And as they stared, the tiger stepped with grace and delicacy out of the cage. He put his nose up and sniffed. He took one tiny step and then another. And then he stopped and he stood still. Sistine clapped her hands and the tiger turned and looked back at them both, his eyes blazing. And then he started to run. He ran so fast it looked to Rob like he was flying. His muscles moved like a river. It was hard to believe that a cage had ever contained him. It didn't even seem possible. The tiger went leaping through the grass, moving farther and farther away from Rob and Sistine. He looked like the sun rising and setting again and again. And watching him go, Rob felt his own heart rising and falling, beating in time. Chapter 28. Oh, said Sistine, in a voice that Rob loved. See, she said, that was the right thing. That was the right thing to do. Rob nodded, but in his mind he saw a flash of green, and he remembered what happened to Cricket. What? Said Sistine, turning to him. What are you thinking about? Rob shook his head. Nothing, he told her. Robert. The sound of his name came floating to them from the direction of the motel. That's my dad, he said, confused. That's my dad calling me. And then they heard Willie Mae. To Jesus, she screamed, her voice high and wild. And then there was a crack of a gun. They both stood still, stunned and silent. And when Willie Mae came running out from under the pine trees and saw them, she stopped. Thank you, Jesus, she said, looking up at the sky. 2 old children, thank you. Come here, she said. She opened up her arms. Come to me. Rob started walking towards her. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong. He wanted to tell her that he did not feel whole, but he did not have the energy or the heart to say anything. All he could manage was putting one foot in front of the other. All he could do was to keep walking toward Willie Mae. Willie Mae led them back, and when Rob saw the tiger on the ground and his father standing over it holding the rifle, he felt something rise up in him, an anger as big and as powerful as a tiger, bigger. "You killed him," he said to his father. "I had to," his father said. "That was my tiger," Rob screamed. "You killed him. You killed my tiger." He ran at his father and he attacked him. He beat him with his fists and he kicked him. But his father stood like a wall and he held the gun up over his head and kept his eyes open and took each hit without blinking. And Rob saw that hitting wasn't going to be enough, and so he did something he thought he would never do. He opened his suitcase, and the words sprang out of it, coiled and explosive. "I wish it had been you," he screamed. "I wish it had been you that died. I hate you. You aren't the one I need. I need her. I need her." The world and everything in it seemed to stop moving, and he stared at his father. His father stared at him. "Say your name," Rob screamed into the silence. "You say it." "Caroline," his father whispered, with the gun still over his head and with his eyes still open. And with that word, with the small sound of his mother's name, the world lurched back into motion like a merry-go-round. It started to spin again. His father put the gun down and pulled Rob to him. "Caroline," his father whispered. "Caroline, Caroline, Caroline." Rob buried his face in his father's shirt. It smelled like sweat and turpentine and green leaves. "I need her," Rob said. "I need her too," said his father, pulling Rob closer. "But we don't got her, neither one of us. What we got, all we got, is each other, and we got to learn to make do with that." "I ain't going to cry," Rob said, shutting his eyes, but the tears leaked out of him anyway. And then they came in a rush, and he just couldn't stop. He cried from somewhere deep inside of himself, from the place where his mother had been, the same place that the tiger had been and now was gone. Rob looked up and saw his father wiping tears from his own eyes. "All right," said his father, holding Rob tight. "That's all right." He said, "You're okay." When Rob finally looked up again, he saw Willie Mae holding Sistine like she was holding a baby, rocking her and saying, "Shh, shh, shh." Willie Mae stared back at him. "Don't think you're going to start pounding on me now," she said. "No, ma'am," said Rob, and he wiped the back of his hand across his nose and slid out of his father's arms. "I went and got your daddy," Willie Mae told Rob as she swayed back and forth, rocking Sistine. "I figured out what you was going to do. And there ain't no telling what that tiger would have done once he got out of that cage. I went and I got your daddy so he could save you." "Yes, ma'am," said Rob. He went over and stood over the open-eyed tiger. The bullet hole in his head was red and small, and it didn't look big enough to kill him. "Go ahead and touch him," said Sistine. Rob looked up. She was standing beside him. Her dress was twisted and wrinkled, and her eyes were red. Rob stared at her, and she nodded. And so he knelt and put out a hand and placed it on the tiger's head. He felt the tears rise up in him again. Sistine crouched down next to him, and she put her hand on the tiger, too. "He was so pretty," she said. "He was one of the prettiest things I'd ever seen." And Rob nodded. "We have to have a funeral for him," Sistine said. "He's a fallen warrior. We have to bury him right." Rob sat down next to the tiger and ran his hand over the rough fur again and again, while the tears traveled down his cheeks and dropped onto the ground. And that's the end of chapter 28.